a Canadian, but I'm now also an American citizen. I applied for my citizenship a few years ago. And yeah, I'm happy to say that I now am a dual citizen.
You've let your English citizenship lapse?
Well, I still have my British passport, so I have that. And I actually also have a Pakistani passport. So I technically am a citizen of four countries, I guess, until three of them find out and kick me out. So,
Wow, now this is a person who could seriously take to a life of crime and just
right.
escape everywhere. But in point of fact, she probably won't do that because she holds a PhD in international human rights law with a specialization in military intervention and war crimes in the Balkan. And I just have to ask you, why did you choose that as your specialty subject?
Well, I've always been really passionate about the protection and defense of human rights around the globe. And it really became a defining issue for me when I was a young law student studying human rights. And that was the time of I'm dating myself here, but that was the time of the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia. And in the period between 1992 to 1995, that's when the Bosnian genocide took place.
Right.
So I was a student witnessing that from the beginning to the culmination. And I became really passionately involved in trying to raise awareness in Canada by bringing a number of Bosnian speakers so that people could see what was happening on the ground. And then I just continued that work throughout my graduate research and then eventually turned it into my debut novel, The Unquiet Dead.
So when you moved to Colorado, did you move away from actually practicing law into, the life of a writer? Because it sounds as though that might be the case.
Yes, I've had kind of a checkered career where I practiced immigration and refugee law for a long time. Then I taught international human rights law and continued to do a fair amount of research on human rights around the globe. And then in between, I became the editor of a magazine, which was a wonderful project for about 3 years. And then we had moved so much, my husband and I, in the United States, and I didn't want to keep taking bar exams. So we discussed it. He said to me, you've always wanted to write a novel and now you finally have time. Why don't you sit down and turn to that full time? So I was able to do that. And yes, and what I've done now is sort of transform my passion for human rights into my books.
So we have a weirdly parallel track because I am a person who, in her third graduate program, read the law in Virginia. And the thing about it is that that means you can only take the bar exam and practice law in Virginia. So when I ended up in Arizona through a process I won't even go into, I can't take the Arizona bar exam, which is why the poison pen exists.
Well, I think we're their loss is our gain.
Well, I didn't know it was a loss. I did an interesting program for the ASU has an honors program, and they asked me to speak on Monday. And I said to them, well, that's very nice. I said, but the other things I can talk about are aging gracefully and small business. And there's actually a connection there because I think people don't have long-term careers anymore, or few people do because the industries keep changing, tech keeps changing, life keeps changing and all. And, when you reach, there's a point you can reach in your life when in fact you can pursue your passion, your case being an author, in my case, doing a not-for-profit bookstore, which I truly love 32 years in. And oppositely, that very day, Elon Musk had just fired everybody at Twitter. And, and I pointed out to the kids, I said, what if you were a person, who thought you had a secure job and you were on a career track at Twitter and you had a, golden parachute and the whole bit. And then Elon Musk came in and just blew it all away and you have no defense because it's a publicly traded company and he bought it. And, I saw they're like 20 years old. So I thought maybe this was going to be too hard for them, to even begin to grasp, but I could see them nodding their heads. And I thought, I'm really glad I don't have to navigate today's world starting at their age. I think it would be very challenging.
Absolutely. And it requires a lot of flexibility and resilience. And there's not much of a guarantee about what the outcome of all your hard work will be. So yeah, yep. It's really tough. I have 12 nieces and nephews, and I think about that all the time, how different their world is from the one I grew up in, where if you studied in a certain path and you got a job, you could pretty much settle in. But I think a lot of people are curious about the world and they don't want to necessarily stay stuck in one thing forever. And I actually think it has made a huge difference to my writing to have those different life experiences and be able to funnel them into my books.
Well, you're absolutely right. It certainly has for me, book selling. Sometimes people say to me, how can you talk to authors every day? How do you have time to research it? I said, actually, given my age and my life experience, I hardly ever have to look anything up. I mean, it's just there and it makes it easy to talk about it. So there are rewards for leading a long life and doing lots of different things. But
May
what
you
we're going to, yep, what we're
may you
going to
keep doing it for decades is what I was going to say.
well, that's very nice of you, but we'll see. So you've had tremendous success as an author. I looked all this up too, and I've read your books along, and I know that your first book was nominated for various awards and was very successful. But you have now decided with Blackwater Falls to start a series with a new character. Is that right, or is this a standalone? I thought it was intended to be a series with.
That's correct. Yes, it's intended to be a series. I've actually already finished work on the sequel. Well, I'm not completely finished. I'm in edits right now, but yes, I'm hoping that the series will have legs and have some room to develop the characters and their conflicts and take them on a journey as I did in my first series. I think the biggest change is with my first crime series, the Isa Khatak and Rachel Getty series. One, it was set in Canada, and two, it had a male protagonist as the lead detective. And now I've kind of flipped that because I have been living in the United States since 2008. And I'm feeling more settled here, more knowledgeable about customs and cultures and society and ideas and politics. So I feel a little bit more confident setting a book in an American setting. And also, it was something my editor and I discussed a lot about the attractiveness of a female lead protagonist. And it seemed some new ground for me, something that I could explore, and groundbreaking in a way because Inaya Rahman, my lead detective, is, I think, the first Muslim woman who's a police officer in a crime series.
In an American crime series, I'm not sure that's true. Michael Robotham wrote a really brilliant, I can't remember the name of it. Forgive me, Michael, because I talk about this book, a British standalone. It wasn't a series. I would have loved it, but she was, I'm reasonably sure, Muslim, and it started with her actually being in a fake pregnancy for various reasons. That's one of the reasons I've always remembered it, because it was great. But I agree with you. And what's interesting to me is that you chose small town Colorado. She's not in a big city. This is not an urban setting. Did you feel like, because it's the smaller community, that you could explore the various issues that this book so well addresses in that smaller environment?
I think so. It really allows you to magnify your lens when you have a very claustrophobic setting where the characters constantly have to interact, not just in one book, but over the course of a series. Everybody knows everybody. And also because I come from cities like Toronto and Chicago and LA. So for me, Denver seems like, even if the story were to be set in Denver, it would still seem relatively like a small city to me. And I actually don't live in Denver. I live south in the suburbs in quite a rarefied atmosphere. So it's been fascinating for me to see how different cultures get along in that setting, and how sometimes the views of people can be so polarized, and then to examine how minorities try to find their place in that society and feel comfortable and feel safe at all the different kinds of interactions they have, not just with law enforcement, but with, all aspects of society, politicians, journalism, so on. So yeah, that's one of the reasons I wanted to be able to make these characters know each other really well. And that helped a lot.
I think you're right that, it would be much more difficult in an urban setting where there are oftentimes more liberal communities, or, the police react differently. Guys on motorcycles don't ride over the hill quite so often. And I am from Chicago, or actually. So, yeah, I thought the small town worked extremely well for what you wanted to talk about, which is indeed how to be a community, an immigrant community, a community of people who were not native to this environment. Although if we really want to stretch it, neither are the white people living in this. Now we are. This is Native American Heritage Month, Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month, which began yesterday. And I think that, there's a much greater awareness now that about colonialization, and, that Western history, Western European history is not the only thing. This is hard for me to switch gears. I mean, come on, at my age, I grew up on an entirely different set of origin stories and holidays and all kinds of things. And it's been very interesting to see them change over the course of my life. When I went to Stanford, I'm not even sure there were any minority students in 1958 at Stanford. I would be very surprised looking back. I can't remember. Maybe in graduate school, but I don't recall in undergraduate school. But then also, it was a surprisingly small university. Arizona State has something like 100,000 students enrolled on different campuses. And I think that my class had like 600 women. And, maybe, I'm sure it wasn't 2,000 people. So, it was more homogenized in part because it was just so small.
Right. I went to a law school that was very small as well. And I think we had, and this is in the 90s, we had maybe 10 students of color, me being one of them. So it hadn't changed that much yet. You saw lots of people of color in undergrad, but in the professional schools and the graduate schools, they hadn't yet penetrated through the way they have now. So sometimes it could be a little bit alienating and a little bit lonely, but I hope new generations of students aren't having the same experience that I've had.
I don't think so, although it'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court decides to do about the affirmative action in universities, which apparently is something they're looking at today. I feel like we're rapidly retrogressing under this Supreme Court. I don't know about you, but I think they're politicians in robes, and I'm really kind of ashamed of the whole legal profession at this point. So I'm actually happier being a bookseller.
I'm happier being a writer, I think.
Yeah, there we are. But anyway, in a rural town in Colorado, there wouldn't have been nearly as much social change or different communities as there would have been in even Denver, for example, which to a great degree is being colonized by people leaving California. So Denver has actually changed quite a lot, I think, in the last, you've probably seen that.
Well, the thing is, as long as I've been living here, when I meet people, I find very few of them are native Coloradans. They've all moved from somewhere else, either for retirement or for a slower pace of life, or because they love the outdoors. So I can always, I always think this is really interesting to me that so few people are actually from Colorado. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to transplant my character too. So she has this widely divergent life experience where she's worked in Chicago on police accountability. And that's, a huge multicultural city with lots of tensions, particularly between minority communities and law enforcement. And now she comes to this little town, and it's, mainly a white town. It's mainly very wealthy. And the disparities between that wealth and the immigrant communities who work in the factories is quite stark. And the kind of protections that immigrants and refugee workers might have in these factories are, again, quite limited. So I loved the idea of having this huge contrast and see how she can deal with it, because it was the same for me moving here from, I grew up in Toronto, then lived in Chicago for a couple of years, then LA, and then came here. And then I first was living more in the city center, so I didn't appreciate the culture shock immediately. But when we moved out to the suburbs, one of the things I noticed is that for several months, I didn't see another person of color. And that took me by surprise. And that took some acculturation. And we call it code switching, when you moderate your identity to fit in with your surroundings. When you see people like yourself, or you hear languages that you recognize, you're a little bit more relaxed, more comfortable. You talk about different things. But when you're in a county that votes pretty strongly Republican, not just for President Trump, but also in the following elections, to have a greater turnout for the Republican Party after they'd had a chance to see those presidential policies and actions. That means that, when you're out in public, like say you're at a coffee shop, if I was in Toronto, my friends and I would be discussing politics at the top of our voices. And here I'm, very quiet and a little bit guarded because I don't really know the reaction of people around me.
Well, we made a conscious decision back in 2016 that we would not be a mission-driven or political bookstore, because our primary goal is fiction, and more, I don't want to say entertaining because that sounds shallow, but basically, we're looking for people who are interested in quality reading and great storytelling and all the rest of it. And if we started introducing political elements and so forth, it wouldn't really mesh with all that. So I feel Maricopa County in Arizona is kind of an island of blue in an otherwise red state. And the other independent bookstore here really is very activist that way, but they're in the heart of downtown Phoenix, and we are not. We're in Scottsdale, which is a different sort of community. And we've tried sticking to that, but it's hard. It's really hard. When you see, I just wrote to the publicist who set up an author event for next Tuesday. And she said, "What is your expected attendance?" I wrote back to her and I said, when you set this up, I think you didn't notice it was going to be election night. And it's going to be really traumatic here in Arizona. I mean, the sheriff's department is now involved in, keeping the GOP inspired poll watchers away and so forth. And I said, I'm not hopeful that we're going to see a lot of live people because, it may be a dangerous night.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I understand that completely.
Yeah. And, you're also right about so many people here, particularly in Phoenix, aren't native Arizonans. So, we have people coming in from all over, bringing different values, different life experiences, and so forth. So I think Arizona is moving purple as a consequence of that. At some point, some of those rural communities are just not going to count as much. But we have a very anachronistic election system, which gives an awful lot of weight to small numbers and to extremists. And I feel like this is going to be the end of my political discussion here in just 1 second. I think that Alaska did a really good thing with ranked choice voting, which in fact has a way of balancing out the extremists and giving people a middle path. And I'm hopeful that other states might decide to adopt that because I think it really is the most sensible thing. It would certainly make me happier here in Arizona if we had ranked choice voting, but we don't. Anyway, let's go back to your character. Inaya, is that correct?
That's right. Yes, Inaya, that's right.
She clearly, as I was reading along, she clearly had some kind of difficult history back in Chicago. She's arrived in this community to basically reboot her career and her life. How much do you want to reveal about, whatever happened to her that brought her to Colorado?
So I can tell you that as a Muslim woman, she used to wear a headscarf. And she was working for the Chicago Police Department, but in a separate office called the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, which is very similar to, let's say, internal affairs. Basically, you're investigating police misconduct and police use of excessive force type of complaints. And that wouldn't make you very popular on a police force, and particularly a police force like Chicago's with such a history of harassment and intimidation of minorities, particularly Black people. So she's in that environment. She's investigating a traffic stop where a white cop stops a young Black man named Marcus McBride, and then this Black man is beaten into a coma. And she's representing Marcus McBride's family, trying to get that police officer kicked off the force and, facing criminal investigation and criminal charges. And he's a very popular officer and he has a lot of support. So she experiences a huge amount of intimidation and harassment. And it reaches a peak where her headscarf is torn from her in such a violent way that she stops wearing it, which is sort of a miniature crisis of faith where she has to weigh her survival versus her value system. And then just to get away from that entire environment. And she's carrying this internal conflict where she feels that hasn't been brave enough faith-wise, but she's also failed the family that she was supposed to represent, because rather than seeing the issue through, she fled when she felt endangered. So she comes to Blackwater Falls, the small town in Colorado, with a lot of baggage and a lot of things to work through. And yet she's still with the police. She's tough. And she hasn't given up on her idea that meaningful change can come from within. And of course, there's a wide variety of viewpoints on this, that the police force should be abolished, should be defunded, that you can't affect meaningful change within the system. It's incapable of reform. But she, as a character, has not reached that determination yet. She still sees the possibility of making change, and she works for the Community Response Unit, which is not as legalistic as the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, in the sense that she's not prosecuting police officers. What she's doing is handling complaints from the community about police misconduct, which again, makes her unpopular. But it's also a way of law enforcement trying to do some internal correction, trying to see what they can do without going to the extreme. And so the questions that come up in the book, in the series, I think, are questions about how deep does criminal justice reform have to be? How serious are these law enforcement problems? Why is the polarization in terms of how we view police in this country so different depending on the color of your skin? And that's not something I try to give answers for. I simply try to have the characters investigate that and show those kinds of interactions. And then it's up to the reader to decide where they stand on those issues, just like it is for Inaya to decide, or her boss, Waqa Saif, to decide where do they stand on those issues.
I thought you did a brilliant job. I noticed that I wrote up a little blurb. I just sent out our newsletter on an anthology that I think Soho Press, I think it's Soho, but it might have been somebody else. Anyway, a number of authors contributed to it, and the proceeds are going to an organization called Safe Traffic Stop. And I realized, that in my entire life, being a privileged elderly white woman, I've never had to face the idea of that kind of a traffic stop. It really caught me by surprise when I saw, okay, here it is, hashtag, safe traffic stop, which implies that in fact, there are a great many people who have to face unsafe traffic stops. And, it's very difficult to work out. With no police, then we'd have anarchy and we would have all kinds of problems. If we do have police, then we have abuse. Police are basically a militaristic in their structure, most police departments. Certainly British police departments. I've had that discussion with a number of British authors. In fact, in Scotland, that department is called the Complaints Department. Ian Rankin has written a couple of books about the complaints. And then many of us watch Line of Duty, in which you wondered that if every cop in London was actually tainted because they had not just one office, but multiple divisions of Line of Duty. And the opportunities for corruption are very high. And interestingly enough, if you went back into crime fiction quite a long way, the way I can, most of the time the police were not depicted as corrupt or dangerous and all. I mean, they were there basically to help whoever the sleuth was, or do it themselves, effect some form of justice. And then it began to shift. In the same way that thrillers, military thrillers today, most of the time the enemy is actually within. It's within the US. I've talked to David Baldacci about that, because when he wrote Absolute Power, and the president turns out to be a serial rapist and murderer and all, that was like the first time, that anybody thought that they could write that about the president of the United States as a fictional character. And now, presidents are possibly accelerating since 2016. But anyway, presidents are being depicted as, villains and the whole bit. So I don't know if that reflects a societal shift or whether mystery writers were just desperate for new material. I'm really not sure.
I think what writers do is, reflect the changing society around them. I know that in my work, I certainly do. And for a long period, uncritically, in crime fiction, we've been treating police officers who are protagonists as unvarnished heroes. Yes, they may have, a drinking problem, or they might have difficult interpersonal relationships, but you don't doubt that they have a solid moral core, and that they're trying to get justice for the victim of whichever murder it is. And I think that shift has come, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, is that we can't look at policing in that same uncritical, starry-eyed way. We have to look at how systems oppress people and what role people in those systems play, because we've seen, the killing of Black people played out for us on our television screens. And we've seen incident upon incident where there's been absolutely nothing to justify that excessive use of force. And so then if police officers are going to be your protagonists, as they are in my book, we have 3 police officers, Lieutenant Saif, we have Inaya, we have her Latina partner, Catalina. And the question is, am I saying that, it's just a few bad apples and here's the hero cops who are still going to deliver justice? Or can I go a little bit deeper and look at the whole system and then try to figure out if these characters are emblematic of a problem within the system, and if they can still effectively hold on to their multiple identities as men and women of color and still serve justice effectively. Can they serve justice more effectively because they identify with people of color and know the problems facing those communities, or are they simply co-opted by the system? And I think it's good that we're seeing that shift in crime fiction where people are asking these questions through and about their characters. But ultimately, I think the job of the writer is to leave it for the reader to decide, to raise the questions, to show those multiple points of view. And then you come to your own resolution at the end. And the great thing about series writing is your characters can take a position at the beginning of the series. And as you move them through several books, and they have these very deeply emotional and pressing cases that they have to solve, they can end up somewhere completely different because they've been educated by life experience and they've learned from perspectives different from their own.
Absolutely true. I mean, if the characters don't evolve, then the series just becomes, comedic in a way. And unfortunately, there are some series where that is the case, but there are different kinds of fiction, different kinds of crime fiction. So if you're writing a cozy, for example, I mean, one of the things I always love is the total economic improbability of the amateur sleuth in any cozy, the woman who runs the chocolate shop on the shores of Lake Michigan in a town of 500. And she's forever like out sleuthing where nobody's at home minding the chocolate shop, which couldn't survive anyway in this town. And, so the reader has to buy into that. If you are a cozy reader, you at the outset in most of those series, you buy into the sheer improbability of it, and you're reading it, for fun. But even in Blackwater Falls, you still have to tell a good story if you're going to engage the reader. So why don't you set up at least the story for us, because you do have a case that you have an instigating incident, you have a case that develops, you have to have an investigation. Actually, one reason I really like police procedurals and private eye stories is that my mind tends to work in that, sequential fashion. I'm not a huge fan of the twisty, trust no one, whatever it is. I like forward movement. Maybe it's the old school training, who knows?
Well, okay, so the book opens with the murder of a teenage refugee from Syria. And the murder is rather spectacular in a gruesome sense, that the girl's body is displayed in an emulation of the crucifixion on the door of the mosque. And so you have this young woman who's already experienced so much difficulty in her quest to survive, getting to America, and suddenly she's dead. And this Muslim community, which is very small, doesn't even have a proper mosque. It's just a building where they're using a floor. Of course, they're stunned and shocked. And they're in this small town called Blackwater Falls, which already has a reputation. The sheriff of Blackwater Falls, a man named Sheriff Grant, already has a reputation of intimidation and harassment and generally ignoring the needs of minority communities who live around and work in Blackwater Falls. So there's no trust between the public and the police. And then the community response unit, which is based out of Denver Police, is called in and said, well, this is exactly the type of case you detectives are supposed to handle because there's some community sensitivity issues here, and we want to make sure we get justice for this girl and have that properly explained to the community. But because there's this level of distrust, we're already at it's almost always a tinderbox, like anything can set it off, the relationship between law enforcement and the community. And so you have Inaya as the lead detective on the case. First of all, she's a practicing Muslim and she uses that mosque. She goes to that mosque. So she's seeing a girl dead, pinned to a door that she knew from the mosque community. She didn't know her well, but she knew her by sight. And so there's a personal impact on her immediately. Her mind's already flashing to the idea of a hate crime, because what else could it be? And then she and her partner, Catalina, and their boss have to get into it. And the boss is the opposite of Inaya. He's completely distant from his heritage and his faith. He's a complete agnostic, and he doesn't actually want any extra sensitivity being afforded here. He wants them to treat it, his detectives to treat it like any other murder and get to the bottom of it. So now Inaya is stepping on Sheriff Grant's toes. He has a lot of contempt for her and Catalina. And she's in this situation where she's trying to find out, but at the same time, she's confronted all of a sudden by young Black activists and a Black civil rights attorney named Arisha Adams, who's the third investigator of this trio of women investigators, who says to her, oh, so you've come here finally to Blackwater when we've had all these problems with the police. And the only reason you've come here is because the girl who's dead is white. But what about the other missing girls who aren't white? And that takes Inaya back that, oh my God, what's been happening in Blackwater Falls? So these women get together to investigate not just the murder of the Syrian teenager, but also the other missing girls, Black girls from Blackwater Falls, to see whether these cases are connected and how they can make progress when they're obstructed at every turn by Sheriff Grant, and also sometimes by their own boss, Waqas Saif.
Yes, I mean, conflict is the thing that, plot thrives on, and you certainly have any number of levels of conflict in this book. And certainly many crime novels have various law enforcement agencies butting heads. It can be the FBI in local law. It can be, in San Francisco, for example, is both a county and a city in itself. So you can have a sheriff for the county and you can have a police chief for the city. And, how does it work between them? And I often think that some crime novelists anyway introduce that kind of conflict because, it heightens the plot, heightens the emotional reaction and all. But in your case, it's clear that it's not an artificial thing. It already exists. I found it interesting that Inaya's boss, I found him a difficult character to really understand. And I assume you wrote him that way on purpose, right?
Because he's alienated from himself and he's complex and he's got a hidden agenda that parallels the main investigation, the main murder investigation, which even his own detectives don't know about.
Right.
So he has to remain, at least for the first half of the book, I think, fairly opaque. And as the series continues, I'm going to unravel him a bit further. But essentially, he's a detective of mixed background. So he's half Palestinian, half Iranian, which is two challenging identities in today's America to have. And because he's faced these challenges all his life, and he has a passion for law enforcement, and he's raising his twin brothers. I mean, they're pretty much grown, but he's been raising them since their parents passed away. So that's his primary responsibility. So it's important to him that he keep his job, that he excel at it, and anything that could take away from that possibility is something he's going to cut off from himself. So if people say, you're an Arab, you're an Iranian, you're an agnostic Muslim or a secular Muslim, how can we trust you in a position of power? You're everything we fear, everything we suspect in this country. So he's like, well, if you suspect those things, I'm not going to be those things. I'm just going to be a typical law enforcement officer. My skin color is not that different from yours because Iranians and Arabs are often very light-skinned, and I don't care about that. And I never bring it up as any part of my personality. I never highlight it. All I'm here to do is investigate murder and get justice. That's it. That's all that matters to me.
So why is he in that particular unit? Because, I mean, he's put himself, he's in a unit where, in fact, these conflicts are going to arise. Whereas if he just was like a cop somewhere, not in that investigative unit, then it would be quite different for him.
Well, I think in Waqas's case, it's really a question of window dressing. So a lot of the time you see these in real life, you see these diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts where the people of color who are being nominated to do the hard work in these positions are ready to tackle it and will approach it. But when they actually get to an issue that's thorny and requires accountability from their counterparts, they find it's really just window dressing. People want you to sit down and shut up and not make waves. Like they'd rather, I'll give you a ridiculous example. But so for example, in the real estate industry, they no longer call a master bedroom because it has shades of the history of slavery. And they've started calling it, I think, the primary bedroom or the main bedroom. But that's a very superficial change. The more authentic change would be making sure that in the housing industry that Black people have opportunities, that have the economic opportunities to buy affordable housing, or that when they sell their houses in the same neighborhood as a white family, their house sells as well as a white family's home does. So, that's substantive change. So Waqas being in charge of this unit for the people who've appointed him, it's like, well, look, he's got a funny name and he's technically a man of color, we put him there. We've done our job in the Denver police. We don't need to do anything else. It doesn't matter what he actually does. And if he's trying to force some kind of systemic change upon us, he's going to encounter a lot of resistance. And that's something I want to bring out over the course of several books. It's something I did as well with my first series with Khatak, who ran a similar, it was called community policing back there. And get to this idea of what's the difference between window dressing and substantive change, and are people only in it for they want to seem to have done something without really changing anything at all because it's uncomfortable or it's expensive or ideologically they have a problem with it. And I think those are the deeper themes that I'm really trying to get to in my work.
Is in fact this unit that Inaya and Saif, it's Denver based, and so Blackwater Falls is a community they've been sent to because of this crime, but they're not going to stay in Blackwater Falls. That's actually the corrupt sheriff's territory.
Right. And so they operate a little bit outside the police force, which is an author taking some latitude and some liberties with how police departments actually function, where they have this kind of, wherever there's a community element, they're called on as consultants. And if the police commissioner decides, they could be asked to take over the investigation. And Blackwater Falls is just a 20-minute drive south of Denver. So it's not that big of a geographical gap, although there is a jurisdictional gap. But that's where they have the authority and empowerment to act if they feel that the existing police force has already not been responsive or has been implicated in some way. Then they need a clean slate. They need to bring in something to satisfy the community that they're taking these complaints seriously and going to do something about it. And that means sidelining someone like, say, Sheriff Grant, who's there's so many whispers about him being corrupt.
Well, I was actually asking that question from an editorial standpoint in terms of this means that Blackwater Falls is the location for this book, but the future books don't need to be in Blackwater Falls because, in fact, if they're based in Denver, they can be sent other places. Or are you planning on sticking to Blackwater Falls?
I think it depends on the longevity of the series. If it goes for a while, they'll definitely branch out. But for the time being, Inaya lives in Blackwater Falls. Catalina does as well. And that's the mosque she goes to. That's where her community is. So yeah, I'm going to try to keep it very grounded in that community and keep bringing different characters back in future books. So you get that sense of, I like in a Martha Grimes novel, who all Richard Jury's friends are, who all of Melrose Platt's friends are, and you look forward to seeing them again and again. So that's something I'm hoping to do, this idea that this is a very place-based story.
Sure.
Because Denver, I think, is much more multidimensional than these small mountain towns and these smaller suburban communities. So it gives me something deeper to tackle in terms of the issues I want to eliminate in my books.
Well, I certainly don't quarrel with you on that analysis in the slightest, but I'm thinking of, let's say, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Archer Mayer, who's also published by your publisher. He started with a community, a small community in Vermont. And then gradually, because he's up to I don't remember, 34 books or something like that. Gradually, we moved the protagonist, a cop called Joe Gunther, from Brattleboro into a larger role. And then Archer created the Vermont Bureau of Investigation, which actually John Sanford did also in Minnesota, so that Vermont was still the key. The state was still the key, but they were able to operate, and he was able to take the people that he worked with in Brattleboro and move them into the VPI. And so he broadened out the remit, let's say, of these officers, and they could go to different communities and run into the kinds of problems that you're talking about. But they stayed a core. They stay as a little, I don't want to say elite, that's not the right word, but they
a core
were
group.
Yeah, exactly, together. And I've noticed that seems to happen in these long running series, is that John did it with Lucas Davenport because, he couldn't just be in the Twin Cities at some point. And in fact, he was pushed to the point where even the Minnesota Bureau of Apprehension, he ran out of juice there. And so he turned him into a U.S. Marshal. And as a U.S. Marshal, Lucas can go anywhere.
Right.
So, but these are people with 30 books in their series,
Right.
You're at book one here, so this is not going to necessarily come up, but I think it's something to think about. you know.
Absolutely. Because you have to think about, have you exhausted all the possibilities of atmosphere and setting in place? And are your characters just going through the motions and doing the same thing over and over again? Or can you offer something new with every book? So I think, at the beginning, you have a lot of time to figure that out and to play out those angles. And then as the series keeps going, absolutely, you have to do new things, not only for yourself as a writer, but to keep your readers engaged and interested in what's happening.
Well,
Even though they will like to see that same group of characters, like I love the characters in Shetland. I want to see those characters, in every book, or on every episode of the TV series. So you're right. If you can bring those characters along wherever you're going, that's one fantastic way of solving the problem, that you creatively have to find new ways to challenge your protagonists and have them do something different, for sure. I completely agree with that.
yep, that's true. I think that the inherent difficulty is the Jessica Fletcher difficulty, which is if you have a small community, how believable is it that this amount, no, I'm serious, how believable is it that this number of people will die, or this, many, evildoers will show up in this small community? And so, if you begin to broaden it, for example, one of the things I think is so interesting about Archer's series, I mean, I'm in the South, right? You're not, in the Southwest. So when we think border, we think South all the time. We think Mexico is like the only border that really, but in point of fact, if you're writing in Vermont or Maine or Minnesota, your border is Canada. And so it's a whole different, it's a north looking, it's a different thing.
A different sensibility for the series too. And I'm hoping to get into these border issues more deeply in my series because of my detective Catalina, who used to run her own NGO helping the undocumented, and has had many run-ins with the Border Patrol and with ICE. And I had deliberately developed her that way because I knew I wanted to talk about what's happening at the southern border in future books and give her the room to bring her expertise into different cases. So I'm hoping that every book in the series will be able to offer something different and interesting. But to your point about small towns, I immediately thought of Midsummer Murders and how many people get killed in that small English village. Like, it's got to be the deadliest place on the planet.
Well, it is. And that's like what I was mentioning earlier about people who read cozy crimes with amateur sleuths who, can't possibly afford what they're doing, is that, there's kind of again, a suspension of disbelief that, that readers will accept. And, it's the same thing about whether you age your series character in real time, or if you leave them, you can age, but they don't need to, or they age.
That's right.
There are all kinds of decisions, and you have to be very careful. I had this discussion with both Ian Rankin and Michael Connelly, for example, both of whose characters have aged themselves out of their police departments, because they've aged in real time. You have to be really careful at the outset in how you structure, the series, so that you don't commit yourself to one thing and then discover, if it develops along, that you've given yourself a problem that didn't necessarily have to exist. One of the great things about writing historical fiction, I was saying that to Reese Bowen last night at her lunch party, and she said, our next book was going to start like the week after this book. I said, great, in historical fiction, everybody's already dead. So from the reader's perspective, they're all dead. So it doesn't matter. You can actually, you could write 12 books in one calendar year in an historical series, and no reader would have a problem with that.
That's
but
right.
You can't do that in a contemporary crime series as easily, because then the reader begins to say, and my favorite part is that really comes up if you have pets in the series. So I have a couple of authors who, have canine-based series, and the dog will never die. The dog is going to live to be like 400 dog years or something, to move along. So plenty of things you can do. But good for you. I thought, this is a very courageous book. And I just looked at Publishers Weekly, have decided what they think the 2022 best lists are. And in mystery and thrillers, Blackwater Falls is one of the 10 books they selected. So felicitations. That's really a very nice accolade for your work.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's very kind of you. Yeah, I'm very excited about the reception the book has gotten. I'm excited to see what people think about it and what kind of debate it provokes after they read it, and curious to know what I can do next and where I can take it. You're right. It's a very careful balance in terms of the age of your characters, where if you don't want to age them too fast, because then they run out of possibilities. But
Right.
at the same time, you want them to still have growth and keep learning things and doing things. And it's so funny. I was just having a conversation with my editor the other day about the sequel, where I had developed one of the relationships between the characters. And then I thought about it afterwards. And I said, I think this went too fast. I think I might need to stretch this out over a few books. Like, what do you think? Have I already like told all there is to say about this particular character arc? And she said, yeah, that's something to think about, but I think it's good and you can just keep building on it. But those are the kinds of questions writers who are hoping to do long-term series think about all the time: is where do they start? Where do they end up? What will they do along the way to just prevent that sameness, that lack of spark in a book? So you're right. You have to do a lot of plotting and thinking about, and I do very in-depth character sketches before I start. So at least psychologically, I know who these people are and what kind of challenges they're going to face, and then put them in different situations to see how they'll react.
Absolutely. And because you have Catalina as one of the characters, Colorado has a very large Hispanic population. And so this one is focused on a different community, but you can certainly enjoy that. We are now, my husband and I, the proud owner of 2 mining claims above Pitkin, Colorado. Believe me, it's a lot smaller than Blackwater Falls. And I've therefore been spending time in Colorado. We're giving it to one of our children who want to spend the summers there, and it's beautiful. It's at 10,500 feet. So summers are when you actually go there. But as a result, even going to Gunnison, which is, I think, a fascinating town, and is clearly experiencing, as so many places in more remote communities experienced compelling growth during the pandemic. I mean, Scottsdale has been just overrun. But even CJ Box was saying to me that Wyoming, we just did a crime conference together, that Wyoming, and Montana have attracted these incomers from more urban, more crowded areas and so forth. But you're going to change the communities now. But the question is also, will they stay? Or will they, as the pandemic recedes and they find the joys of urban life are not quite the same as, of rural life will not be the same as urban life. Will they go back? It's very hard to know how that will work out. And certainly in Colorado and around Denver, those are going to be, I think, big issues as tech, particularly as the big tech companies are exiting California for various reasons, in Denver and Austin, Texas, and Phoenix are becoming, more of a tech hub. So lots of interesting possibilities for you in Colorado. Why don't we call Jacob in to see if, after all this, there are any questions, or if I've just stunned the audience and they don't care. Hi,
Jacob. It certainly is. Yep. So I do have a few questions for you. Julie says, thank you so much for writing a strong character who believes change is possible and is willing to work for it. Do you already know how the rest of the series is going to play out?
I know how some events in the characters' lives are going to play out, but I don't actually know where they're going to end up yet. It's too early for me to tell. And I still like to be surprised about things they've done. I did some things in the sequel that I was not planning to do, just because they started taking over and it seemed like a good direction to follow. But I have a general idea of, this is where my character begins, this is where my character ends, but I haven't filled in all the details along the way yet.
Okay.
And thank you for the kind words also. Thank you, I appreciate them.
You're getting so many questions, I got to scroll up to read them.
I know, it's hard because they move so fast. It's hard to read them sometimes.
Do you have any reading recommendations, particularly any novels that inspired you to write this, or that you took inspiration from?
Not books so much as real life events. I think that this is my pandemic book, where I was sitting at home, not traveling, not able to go to Canada for 18 months because the border was closed. And I was just following what was happening with the Black Lives Matter movement. So the killing of George Floyd, what happened here in Colorado with the killing of Elijah McClain. And I've been following the border issues as well, the caravans and the sort of hysteria about them. And I knew, so I always begin as a writer with themes that I'm interested in exploring, or either human rights or civil rights issues. And then I think, if I want to write about this particular issue, how am I going to frame that as a crime, and what kind of characters do I need? So that was my my starting point. And then along the way, I would read all these articles, police reports, interview people. I talked to a lot of police officers. I talked to Border Patrol. I talked to activists from the Latina community, Latinx community, and from the Black community, and from Muslim communities, to get a sense of where they thought the fault lines are, what the real challenges are facing us, and to fellow crime writers who've tackled this material as well. And the more research you do, the more ideas you get. You hear some really fascinating voices from witness testimony, and then you think about, how can I incorporate that voice into a character?
A question I forgot to ask you, dumb me, is why have you chosen the crime novel as compared to other forms of fiction to tell your stories?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I have perfected my answer to this question, which is that I think that people love crime fiction for one reason, and that's because they're really interested in the puzzle and they want to solve the puzzle. And I have this idea that I think there is no greater puzzle than the human heart and the things that motivate us. Why do we do the things we do in the particular way we do them? And crime novels are about the pursuit for justice, and human rights and civil rights is also about the pursuit for justice. And the area that I used to work in, international human rights law, human rights abuses are really just crimes on a large scale. So I'm doing the same kind of work, but in a different medium.
Thank you. Very nice answer.
Thank you.
Okay, Labibia Khan asks, will there be a crossover between your previous crime series and Blackwater Falls series?
Oh, that's such a great question. I don't know if I'm allowed to answer this one, but I placed an Easter egg in Blackwater Falls. And that will tell you that, in fact, I am hoping to connect my two crime series mainly through the characters. And if you've read, I'll give you a clue as well. If you've read The Unquiet Dead, you'll be able to find the Easter egg in Blackwater Falls.
Okay, perfect. Well, I had a question of how did your work or education in international human rights inform your writing of the novel, particularly the Yugoslavian situation with there's an ethnic minority and also a religious minority and a community, and how did that inform your writing? Not only the history of racial crimes here in the United States, but also just the psychological aspect of human behavior.
Ooh, that's a tough question. I mean, I think I worked out all of the survivor testimony that I looked at for my graduate research into the Bosnian genocide. And when you're immersed in that kind of work, when you're hearing from people who've survived genocide, who've lost family members to genocide, and not just genocide, but all the horrific crimes that accompanied it, the torture camps, the rape camps, and you have those voices in your head, they never go away. And in some way, they're always speaking to you, and they're always asking for their own voices to be uplifted and their story to be told. So I had written a lot about the Bosnian genocide before I ever turned to fiction. And when I turned to fiction, I still wrote about it. I wrote a play, I wrote endless amounts of poems, I wrote songs even, but I still didn't feel that I had made the full use of that story that I could have, particularly as 25 years passed, and we now began this memorialization process that was simultaneously accompanied by genocide denialism, which is, I think, at its peak right now, particularly about the Bosnian genocide. So I used all of that research to tell a story, about the survivors in the setting of a crime. And it's not a giveaway to tell you that the book, The Unquiet Dead, opens with the death of a fugitive war criminal. And then the question is, who killed him and why? And then the survivors, when you get into the story of the survivors, you understand why this man died. And it ultimately leaves you with the question that I always have in that line of work, which is, when you see crimes this horrific on such a massive scale, what's the adequate punishment for them? What does justice actually look like in that case? So that's the theme, the subject I explored in The Unquiet Dead. And then, moving forward, other subjects that I wrote about in that series were the Syrian refugee crisis, the treatment of political prisoners in Iran, terrorism and its impact on the global Muslim community, and then finally hate crimes and a mass shooting in a mosque. But when I shifted my attention to the American setting, I could see that there's a different set of issues that are really prevalent here, which is, number one, law enforcement's interaction with the Black community, how this country, the citizens of this country, feel about the undocumented, about people trying to come here from the southern border. And then finally, as a Muslim woman, a practicing Muslim who's very observant and very plugged into those communities, and as someone who tracks hate crimes, with the Trump presidency, we saw the Muslim ban and this intense Islamophobia. And I wanted to write about that and that's why I created this set of characters: a Black civil rights attorney, a Latina police detective, and Inaya, who's Afghan Pakistani, and then her boss, who's kind of deracinated and definitely agnostic, but still is carrying that baggage, which is given extra weight by the fact that they're police officers. I don't know if I answered that question.
No, excellent. That was excellent.
Yeah.
By the way, who's publishing your book?
Minotaur Books, St.
Okay.
Martin's Press.
Great. How are we doing on time?
It's the mystery imprint at St. Martin's Press, and they do. We do a lot of work with them, Jacob. They have a very large group of authors, and they've done some, I think, really brave things as publishers. They've taken on some books that might be more difficult for a different publisher to float, so to speak. So we make a conscious effort to work with them as much as we can, because I'm all in favor of, I'm not really interested in selling bestsellers. We do a lot of bestsellers, as it all turns out, but I think our real job is to develop new voices, new series, and try to get readers to take a chance on something that's not obvious.
That's absolutely spectacular. And the team I work with at Minotaurs is phenomenal. They've been so supportive from the beginning. And you're right, I don't know a lot of publishers who would necessarily be interested in these stories, particularly when I began back in 2014. You really did have to take a chance on the kind of character no one's ever seen in this setting before, the Muslim who's the hero figure rather than the one to be suspected and feared. So I've had a phenomenal working relationship with everyone at Minotaur Books.
You have had. I was scrolling through my phone, not because I was bored, but I was trying to find, I can't remember the name of Dan Fesperman's first novel, which won all kinds of awards and which I really thought was important. And it was, in fact, about the Bosnia. He was a reporter, and he covered, he was in Bosnia, and he wrote a really searing crime. Do you remember the name of it? Because I'm just going completely blank. Sorry, Dan. About it, but it's a really important book to read. And for some reason, I was just looking in the list of his books. It's not there. And I don't, because I've done all these books with him, and I will recognize that it's missing, but I can't remember what it is.
I remember The Cellist of Sarajevo was written by a Canadian novelist, but it wasn't crime fiction, but it was beautifully done.
It's a different book. I will, I'm going to make one more pass. Jacob, do you have any more questions that you want to ask?
I think that's it for the Facebook questions. Yeah, I think we're.
Do you know what they may have done? Is they may have actually renamed the book.
Oh.
Maybe that's my problem.
Yeah, that's what happened with the fourth book in my Khatek series.
No, I found it.
Oh, you did? It was renamed for the UK.
Yay! It was published in 1999, so relatively closer to that conflict. It's called Lie in the Dark. And he won both American and British awards for that book. It was an extremely brave book and based upon, in part, his own experience. So if you're wondering what Ausma, aka Alice here, is talking about, that's a wonderful way through a novel that you can go back and learn about some of the horrors that she's discussing, which is sometimes the very best way to read history, is to let fiction illuminate it for you. Right.
Well, you've given me a great book, Rex. I'm going to look that one up myself.
You really should. It's a terrific book. He's an amazing author, and he has built a successful but relatively modest career based on writing about difficult things. So he's an author that you should read, because I think you'd find a real kinship in him.
Fantastic.
I'm a huge fan. So, there we are. So is Patrick, as it all turns out. Jacob, was that it?
That's it. Yep.
Wonderful. Well, Ausma, it's been a real pleasure to meet you. Thank you for letting us talk to you about Blackwater Falls. Let me hold it up here. It's a gorgeous production, and it's now in print, so you can certainly purchase it. And it's a book well worth reading on many levels. And I really like the characters in it. I'm looking forward to seeing them develop. So let me wish you all a good evening and happy holiday if we don't see some of you before next year.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. I really enjoyed the conversation.
It's been fabulous. I was looking out you can't see it from here, but we have a giant saguaro right outside my office window, and the Christmas light people came last Friday. Did I send you the photo, Jacob, of the giant saguaro? I mean, it's all lit up. I'll send it to you. We came home from a crime conference, and I'm looking there at this, I'm from Chicago where there's real winter, right? And I'm looking at this, Christmas saguaro out there, and I think I have to adjust to all of it. But what I wonder is, what happened